The scourge of misinformation and disinformation on the internet presents one of the most pervasive and complex challenges of our time. The issue threatens public safety, social cohesion, and even our democracy by enabling mass manipulation and undermining public trust in outcomes. The scale of the problem is staggering, and it is scary, because we know a democracy is only as strong as the information available. And the fact that you have a situation where misinformation and disinformation is currently in an unchecked environment is simply not right. The World Economic Forum has classified misinformation and disinformation as one of the top global risks for the next 2 years. So that really is a sobering, just an incredibly sobering warning. We only need to look at what's happening daily on social media platforms around, and unfortunately all too often platformed in our legacy media, where misinformation and disinformation is platformed on traditional media. And I will get to that and the issue that this bill does not address in a moment when it comes to that. And unfortunately, you only have to see the outcome today of the US election, where the amount of false facts, misinformation that has been part of that debate is staggering and incredibly scaring for what that means and how it influences outcomes. And so with the federal election looming in Australia by March or May next year, I am incredibly concerned that Australia is woefully unprepared to counter AI-generated and pushed content around that is misinformation and disinformation. So there's ample evidence that misinformation and disinformation is a critical issue facing Australians. In 2022, Roy Morgan's survey showed that over 2/3 of Australian adults have encountered deceptive views and misinformation. In a speech to the National Press Club this year, the Australian Federal Police Commissioner, so I hope all members of this place can at least take into account the warning from the Australian Federal Police Commissioner, stating that social media companies are pouring accelerant on the flames of misinformation and of extremism. Now, if that isn't a sobering warning, I don't know what would get you to pay attention. You only have to look at some of the practical examples. For example, during the Bondi stabbing attacks and another stabbing incident in Sydney, the spread of graphic and false information and posts and the speed at which that inflamed the community was really concerning. And it demonstrated the impact of misinformation on safety and community cohesion. So that's why it is so urgent that we do address this issue. The government's bill builds on the draft released last year, and there has been a fair amount of consultation. I've been critical with the timing of and ability to provide submissions. I was able to provide a submission to the exposure draft early, and I'll address some of the concerns that I had there. In that submission, I expressed concern about the extensive powers that were being granted to the Australian Communications and Media Authority, and my concern that there is not sufficient oversight over that body. And I'm disappointed that this has still not really been addressed. ACMA's capacity to handle these new responsibilities is still unproven, yet it is a crucial role in how we are going to fight misinformation and disinformation. There's no independent external review mechanism to ensure accountability of ACMA. I've expressed my concerns that ACMA ultimately reports to the Minister and therefore the government, and I know that is the area that the opposition has taken to criticise this bill in relation to concerns of how this can be manipulated for political gain. I don't disagree, because if changes of government, I'm assuming that advantage of these loopholes and this fault in this legislation would be taken by all sides of government, and that is a huge concern. We need that independent external review of ACMA and having that at arm's length from the Minister and from government, and that is an area I'll continue to discuss with the Minister. We know there has been some movement since the exposure draft. Under it, the powers afforded to the minister were capable of being misused should the political and social environment enable this to happen, and could be used in a way to threaten freedom of speech and democracy. Now, the bill does provide an impact assessment on freedom of expression, yet this is only set to occur 3 years after commencement. So the review provisions is that there's going to be an assessment after 3 years of the impact on freedom of speech and the operation of ACMA. My concern is that 3 years is a long time and that more regular review should be required. I feel the review should be taking place annually, certainly in the early years of operation of this bill, to ensure it is meeting the purpose intended and that it is doing so in the most effective way. We need to ensure transparency and responsiveness to any unintended consequences, and that's why a overly maybe burdensome and more earlier review process can be that overprotective, that extra layer of certainty. And I note from briefings with the minister that there are provisions. Obviously, the ACMA will publish yearly account of its engagement and action and use of the powers. And whilst that provides some accountability, I still would urge the government to consider more frequent review than the 3 years provided at the moment. The definitions of misinformation and disinformation in the original draft were broad and untested, and that posed a huge risk of misuse. Now, the bill now contains more refined definition. There's been much discussion between the crossbench and a number of members with the minister, and also it has been noted that and those changes have been welcome. The Australian Human Rights Commission has called largely positive, but is concerned about significant issues remaining that could impact freedom of expression. And I will come back to that in a moment. I also welcome the adjustments the Minister and the Department has made in relation to excluded content provisions, now renamed as excluded dissemination, which clarify that these powers don't apply to professional news content. This is a step in the right direction, but further discussion is needed to fully understand and manage the implications of these changes. And I should note that whilst it's essential to have exceptions for news content, and we do so under defamation law, we do so under the Privacy Act and so many other areas of legislation, those exceptions for news content come with a responsibility to act with ethical diligence in accordance with the codes, and ACMA there as the body to oversee how media and news actually operate must be an effective cop on the beat. It must be an effective check against, for example, news and media platforms, legacy platforms, using those exceptions to be the very conveyors of misinformation and disinformation. And we know that's a risk because we saw it, right, in the practical example, and unfortunately the real-life situation of the Bondi stabbing, where a legacy media company named the wrong person. And nothing in this Act would prevent that from happening. Now, of course, defamation proceedings kicked in and that was the resolve. But there is a great concern where, well, the hope is that this legislation would stop the misnaming of the person from getting the kind of traction and growth and, and spreading in an online content. And that hopefully would stop a legacy media from jumping onto the misinformation and conveying it further. But it does raise that question that nothing in this bill addresses misinformation and disinformation as published and pushed by legacy media companies. And that is still a step that needs much work. Another key amendment that's been introduced is the access rights for independent researchers to review platform data. Now, this is essential, and I do welcome that the government has moved on this issue. I know many on the crossbench and many other groups have approached, and pushed for these amendments. It's incredibly important that online platforms be compelled to produce their data so it can be analysed and used for research, so we can actually assess the risks of what is happening online, from eating disorders to online bullying to mental health. There are so many areas where researchers, legitimate independent researchers, need to have that access, need to have access rights for the platform data. And we know the platforms hold that data very closely. They do not share it willingly. Now, this will be managed again by ACMA with an initial review after a year to see how that's going. Again, this is a lot of responsibility being put on ACMA, and which again raises my concern that we need a review of the operations of ACMA and make sure they are robust, diligent and fit for purpose. Now, this change in relation to independent researchers helps address the opacity of social media platforms and promote a better research into even the very impact of misinformation. Now, one of the fundamental considerations of this bill is the balance between free speech and public safety. The Human Rights Commission has raised concern that this bill could infringe on free speech rights. But at the same time, we have to acknowledge, and I should say the High Court has acknowledged, freedom of speech is not a right to spread misinformation and disinformation. There are two very different things in that. And the human right to free speech does not override the human rights in relation to racial vilification or discrimination and all the other aspects of human rights. And I do find it interesting that so many in the oppositions are here, rallying the call of human rights, but yet no one is prepared to stand up for a Human Rights Act. Other than the crossbench putting it forward, there has been objection to actually codifying human rights here, having a specific law to address that. So it is always a really difficult balance in between those different rights. The right to be safe, to not be racially vilified or to be vilified for someone's sexual orientation. Free speech is not an unlimited right, and that is the balance that has to be done. And I'd say in the context of the campaign around this legislation, there has been a lot of conspiracy theories, and we certainly have received a lot of information both ways. But overwhelmingly, we have to take into account the widespread damage caused by misinformation and disinformation. And to me, it ultimately, whilst I have some concerns, highlights the need to implement this legislation. The bill may not address every aspect of the complex issue. Its immediate implementation, nevertheless, could provide a solid foundation to begin tackling these challenges. Improvements to be made through ongoing review. Essentially, I see this as a start of putting up some guardrails against misinformation and disinformation. But I think much work is going to need to be done, and we are going to need to be incredibly vigilant to make sure that those guardrails are working effectively. But I should say we can't talk about misinformation and disinformation without talking about something that I have been trying for 4 years to get all members in this place to sign up to, which is a standard similar to in consumer advertising in political advertising. It is absolutely unacceptable that we have still yet to legislate against misleading and deceptive advertising in political advertising. I have put forward a Stop the Lies bill. I have put forward voter protections, and despite the government saying it will act on this, we have not yet seen that, and we are running out of time again for another election. So what I say to people is the only way you are protected is you have to inoculate yourself against misinformation and misleading and deceptive content. If it doesn't sound right, it seems a little bit like an odd claim, it probably is. Check your sources. Make sure you know where to go to for fact-checked information. So the role and authority of ACMA will require careful monitoring in this situation. Historically, ACMA has been partly funded by the media sector it oversees, and it has not demonstrated robust accountability. And we know we've seen that in too many examples. Now, the Minister, and I've had many discussions, has indicated that a clear statement of ministerial expectation will be made that will set the bar high for ACMA to act, and that expanded role will be care to make sure that that expanded role meets public expectations of integrity and transparency. So whilst I have concerns, I commend the bill to the House as an important guardrail against misinformation and disinformation.